Four men, drunk on arrogance and bad decisions, thought they had found an easy target at a lonely gas station. A young woman, alone, minding her own business. They had no idea she had spent years in the Navy SEALs, training to break men twice their size without breaking a sweat. By the time they realized their mistake, it was already too late. The neon lights of the gas station flickered against the pitch-black sky, casting an eerie glow over the deserted parking lot. It was well past midnight, the kind of hour when most people had either found their way home or were looking for trouble. For Ava Carter, it was just another stop on her long drive back to base. She had spent the last few weeks visiting her father, a retired Marine boss on the outskirts of Houston. Now, with only a few hours left before sunrise, she was ready to get back to the life she had chosen. A life built on discipline, danger, and the unwavering belief that no one, no matter how strong or ruthless, could ever break her. She had fought in places most people couldn't find on a map, faced down enemies who lived and breathed violence, but nothing tested her patience more than entitled thugs who thought the world owed them something. As she stepped out of her car, stretching her tired limbs, she was barely paying attention to the blacked-out SUV idling near the entrance. The moment she walked toward the gas pump, the doors swung open and four men spilled out. They weren't in a hurry, moving with the kind of slow arrogance that came from years of getting away with whatever they wanted. She had seen their type before, predators who mistook confidence for invincibility. One of them, tall, lean, and wearing a leather jacket that had seen better days, whistled low as he walked up. Well, what do we have here?" His voice dripped with amusement, like he had just found something to entertain himself with for the night. The others laughed, spreading out slightly, forming a loose semicircle around her. Ava barely glanced up as she inserted her card into the gas pump. "Just passing through," she said, her tone calm, even disinterested. The man in the leather jacket exchanged a glance with his buddies, a smirk playing at his lips. "That's so, 'cause it looks to me like you could use some company." His hand lifted, resting casually against the top of her car door. Wrong move. Ava exhaled slowly, her grip tightening ever so slightly on the pump handle. She had hoped to make it through this stop without an incident, but it seemed these guys had different plans. What they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly understand, was that they had just picked the absolute worst person to mess with. The gas pump beeped, signaling the start of the fuel flow, but the tension in the air had already begun to thicken. Ava could feel the shift, the way the men positioned themselves, their weight shifting slightly, preparing for whatever they thought was coming next. They weren't here for small talk. They wanted a reaction. The leader, the one in the leather jacket, tilted his head, eyes scanning Ava from head to toe like he was sizing up his next purchase. "You're pretty quiet, sweetheart," he mused, tapping his fingers against the roof of her car. "That's all right." "I like a challenge." Ava exhaled slowly, forcing herself to stay relaxed. She wasn't afraid. These men weren't a threat. Not really. They had no idea what they were dealing with. No idea that she had spent years in the most grueling training on the planet, that she had survived missions that chewed up and spit out some of the toughest men alive. If they knew, they wouldn't be standing this close. The second guy, shorter but built like a brick wall, stepped closer, grinning. "Come on now, don't be rude. We're just being friendly." Ava's fingers twitched at her side, instinct screaming at her to neutralize the threat before it escalated. But she didn't want to make the first move. Not yet. "Not interested," she said simply, her voice even and firm. The third guy, tall, wiry, with a cigarette dangling from his lips, chuckled, shaking his head. "Not interested. Man, that's cold." He took a step closer, close enough that she could smell the stale smoke on his breath. Ava finally looked up, meeting his gaze with a calm, unreadable stare. "Back up." The words weren't loud, they weren't aggressive, but they carried something more dangerous than volume: certainty. Leather Jacket smirked, clearly amused. "Oh, she's got a little fight in her. I like that." Ava didn't move, didn't flinch. She had learned a long time ago that confidence wasn't about posturing, about acting tough. Real confidence, real power, came from knowing exactly what you were capable of and having the discipline to hold back until it was absolutely necessary. The fourth guy, the quietest of the group, shifted uneasily. He wasn't as sure as the others. Maybe he recognized something in Ava's posture, something in the way she stood too still, too controlled. "Hey man, maybe we should..." But Leather Jacket wasn't listening. He reached out, grabbing Ava's wrist. The moment his fingers made contact, Ava moved. It happened in less than a second, a shift of weight, a twist of the wrist, and before any of them could react, Leather Jacket was airborne. His body slammed against the pavement with a brutal, sickening thud. The air knocked from his lungs in a single, gasping wheeze. The silence that followed was deafening. The other three men froze, eyes wide, staring at their leader sprawled on the ground, groaning in pain. Ava straightened, adjusting her sleeve like nothing had happened. "I told you to back up," she said evenly. Brick Wall was the first to snap out of it. His face twisted with anger, and he lunged. Big mistake. Ava sidestepped effortlessly, using his own momentum against him. A sharp pivot, a precise sweep of the leg, and suddenly he was crashing into the side of the SUV, his head bouncing off the metal with a dull thud. Cigarette scrambled backward, hands raised in disbelief. "What the hell?" Ava didn't wait. She closed the distance in 2 strides, snatching the cigarette from his mouth and flicking it to the ground, before gripping the front of his jacket and yanking him forward. "I don't have time for this," she muttered before twisting and slamming him face first onto the hood of the car. The fourth guy, the hesitant one, had seen enough. He stumbled backward, hands raised. "Look, we didn't mean anything by it." Ava let go of cigarette, who slid bonelessly to the ground, groaning. She turned to the last man standing. "Then leave." He didn't need to be told twice. He turned and bolted, disappearing into the darkness without so much as a second glance. Leather Jacket was still coughing on the ground, trying to push himself up. Brick Wall groaned from where he was slumped against the car. Cigarette hadn't moved. Ava sighed, rolling her shoulders. "You all should make better choices," she said, then turned back to her car, yanking the pump from the gas tank and screwing the cap back on. She slid into the driver's seat, started the engine, and gave one last glance in the rearview mirror. The 3 men were still there, trying to process what had just happened. Ava smirked. Then she hit the gas and disappeared into the night. The highway stretched out before Ava, empty and silent except for the low hum of her engine. The confrontation at the gas station had been unnecessary, a waste of time, but not surprising. She had seen it before. Men mistaking quiet confidence for weakness, misjudging someone simply because they didn't flaunt their strength. That kind of arrogance always led to the same outcome. As the neon lights of the station faded in her rearview mirror, she exhaled, letting the tension in her muscles unwind. It was supposed to be a simple drive back to base, but trouble had a way of finding her, no matter how much she tried to avoid it. She checked the clock, 3:14 a.m. She still had a few hours left before sunrise. Shaking her head, she reached for the water bottle in the cup holder, taking a slow sip as the events replayed in her mind. It wasn't just about those men being reckless. Something about the way they moved, the way they spread out, had felt practiced. That wasn't random thuggery. It was coordinated, intentional. Ava's instincts prickled. She didn't like loose ends. Most guys who got put down that hard stayed down. They didn't regroup, didn't chase after a fight they knew they couldn't win. But something told her this wasn't over. The way the fourth guy had bolted, not even looking back, that kind of fear only came from knowing things were about to escalate. Her fingers tapped the steering wheel, mind working through possibilities. Were they just another group of drunks looking for trouble? Or was there more to it? She had learned a long time ago not to ignore her gut. 10 minutes down the road, her suspicions were confirmed. Headlights appeared in her rearview, bright and closing fast. A black SUV, same one from the gas station. Ava's jaw tightened. They hadn't learned their lesson. She watched the car approach, then move into the lane beside her, keeping pace. The windows were tinted, but she didn't need to see their faces to know who was inside. Leather Jacket had gotten back up, and this time he had a plan. The SUV edged closer, testing her, seeing if she'd run. Ava sighed. They wanted a chase. They weren't getting one. Keeping her expression calm, she downshifted slightly, matching their speed without hesitation. The SUV veered, edging into her lane just enough to try and intimidate her. She didn't flinch. Her hands remained steady on the wheel, eyes locked forward. Then, just as the SUV attempted to swerve again, she slammed the brakes. Hard. The sudden deceleration caught them off guard. The SUV shot past her before they could react, skidding slightly as the driver overcorrected. Before they could recover, Ava was already making her next move. She downshifted, punched the accelerator, and swung into the opposite lane. The roar of her engine cut through the night as she surged forward, pulling alongside them in a matter of seconds. For the first time, she saw their faces clearly. Leather jacket in the passenger seat, bruised and seething. Brick wall behind the wheel, knuckles white on the steering wheel. Cigarette in the back, clutching his ribs, eyes wide with something that looked a lot like regret. The fourth guy, the one who had run, was nowhere to be seen. Ava smirked, smartest one of the group. Leather jacket rolled down his window, yelling something she couldn't hear over the wind. She didn't need to. His intent was clear. They weren't here to scare her anymore. They wanted revenge. She gave them a bored look. Then, with one precise flick of her wrist, she cut the wheel, veering toward their SUV just enough to make it seem like she was going to slam into them. Panic hit their faces at the same time. Brick wall jerked the wheel in response, overcorrecting again, and this time, he didn't recover. The SUV swerved violently, tires screeching, before it spun out completely, skidding off the road in a blur of metal and headlights. Ava didn't slow down. She checked her mirrors, saw the SUV come to a halt in the ditch, steam rising from the hood. No explosion, no rollover. They'd live, but they wouldn't be coming after her again. She exhaled, relaxing her grip on the wheel. That was over, for now. Ava kept driving, her heartbeat steady despite the adrenaline still coursing through her veins. The night air was crisp, the road stretching ahead of her like a dark ribbon, winding through the desolate outskirts of town. She wasn't rattled, she never was, but something about the way those men had acted lingered in the back of her mind. It wasn't just a random act of aggression. She had seen plenty of fights, dealt with more than her fair share of thugs who thought they were untouchable. But this was different. The way Leather Jacket had looked at her in the gas station, the way he had regrouped so quickly after getting put down, there was intent behind it, something deeper than just wounded pride. And now, sitting in a wrecked SUV on the side of the road, they were either licking their wounds or calling for backup. Ava wasn't the type to wait and find out. She needed to know who they were and why they had been so quick to escalate. She pulled off onto a side road, parking beneath a canopy of trees where the shadows swallowed her car whole. Her phone buzzed in the cup holder. Private number. She sighed. Only a handful of people had her number, and none of them ever called unless it was urgent. She picked up. "On talk. You're making a mess," a familiar voice said on the other end. Marcus, one of her old handlers. His voice was smooth, controlled, but there was an edge to it, the kind that only came when he had to clean up something unexpected. "Care to explain why a local crew is broadcasting your face all over the underground, like you just shot the mayor?" Ava's jaw tightened. "They came after me first. I just returned the favor." Marcus exhaled, the static over the line making it sound more like a low growl. "Yeah, well, they're not just some punks looking for trouble. That was the Rourke crew. You know, the same Rourke crew that's been running protection rackets, gun smuggling, and God knows what else across 3 states. The same one that just made a deal with the kind of people you don't want watching you." Ava rubbed her temple. "Great. And here I thought they were just a bunch of idiots trying to pick a fight." "Oh, they are. But they're connected idiots. And now they're pissed. Word is they're mobilizing." "Let them," she said, voice calm. "Ava." She hung up before he could finish. She didn't need a lecture. If the Rourke crew was coming, she needed to be ready. She opened her glove compartment, pulling out a worn black case. Inside was her sidearm, a sleek, well-maintained SIG P320. She checked the mag. Full. Good. Next, she reached beneath her seat, retrieving a combat knife she kept strapped to the frame. She had learned long ago that being prepared meant more than just carrying a weapon. It meant knowing when to use it. Her mind raced through the possibilities. The Rourke crew wasn't the type to let things go. If Marcus was right, and he usually was, they wouldn't just come after her in the middle of the night with another SUV full of muscle. They would wait. Plan. Strike when it was least convenient. She needed to take control of the situation before that happened. Ava started the engine, pulling back onto the highway. She wasn't going home. Not yet. If the Rourke crew wanted a war, she was going to take the fight to them first. Ava drove with purpose, her mind sharpening every possible scenario into something tangible. She had been in enough situations like this to know that waiting was a mistake. If the Rourke crew was regrouping, then she had a narrow window to disrupt whatever retaliation they were planning. The way they had moved at the gas station, it wasn't random. They had been looking for something, or someone, and she had disrupted their plans. That meant they had to react, and she could use that to her advantage. She pulled into a deserted lot near an old warehouse, cutting the engine and stepping out, the cool night air brushing against her skin. From the outside, the warehouse looked abandoned, but she knew better. Places like this were rarely empty. She approached cautiously, her movements silent, blending into the shadows. Inside, she could hear voices, low, urgent, and laced with frustration. She slipped through a side entrance, pressing her back against the cold steel wall as she listened. "We can't let this slide," a voice growled. "She humiliated us. We go after her now. We're walking into a trap," another answered. "She's not normal. You saw what she did to Clay. That wasn't luck." Ava smirked. At least they weren't completely stupid. She crept forward, catching a glimpse of the group, 4 of them, gathered around a table littered with maps and weapons. The leader, a stocky man with a scar running from his temple to his jaw, was hunched over, eyes burning with anger. "Then we don't go after her head-on," he muttered. "We find out who she is. Nobody moves like that unless they've had training. I want her history, her family, everything." Ava's muscles tensed. They were already digging. That meant they weren't just looking to retaliate. They wanted leverage. She couldn't let that happen. Without hesitation, she moved. Swift, precise, a ghost in the night. The first man never even saw her coming. A quick strike to the throat and he was down, choking on silence. Before the others could react, she was on them. A knee to the gut, an elbow to the temple. 2 more fell before Scarface even had time to reach for his gun. He turned, wild-eyed, but Ava was already there, pressing her blade against his throat. "You were saying?" she murmured, her voice as cold as the steel against his skin. He froze, his breath ragged. What do you want?" Ava leaned in, her grip steady. "I want you to go back to Rourke and tell him he's making a mistake." She increased the pressure just enough to make his pulse spike. "Tell him if he comes after me again, I won't be this polite." Scarface swallowed hard, nodding. Ava stepped back, keeping her eyes locked on him as he staggered toward the exit. "Go," she ordered, "and pray I don't see you again." He didn't need to be told twice. Within seconds, he was gone, leaving only the unconscious bodies of his men behind. Ava exhaled, rolling her shoulders. The message had been sent. Now it was up to Rourke whether he was smart enough to listen. She retrieved a burner phone from her pocket, dialing a number she hadn't used in a long time. After 2 rings, a voice answered. "And I was wondering when you'd call." "Things are moving fast," Ava said. "I need intel, everything on Rourke and his crew." A pause. Then, "You sure you want to go down this road?" Ava glanced at the bodies around her, her jaw tightening. "I think we're past that point." "All right," the voice said. "Give me a few hours." Ava ended the call and stepped back into the night, her next move already forming in her mind. Ava left the warehouse, her mind already working through the next steps. The Rourke crew had been rattled, but that didn't mean they were done. If anything, they'd come back harder. That was the nature of men like them. Wounded pride meant reckless decisions. She needed to stay ahead of them, keep them reacting instead of planning. She drove back to the small motel she had checked into under an alias, scanning the parking lot before stepping out. No unusual cars, no movement in the shadows. Still, she didn't let her guard down. Slipping inside, she locked the door, pulled the blackout curtains and checked her gun. A part of her longed for the silence of the barracks, the regimented security of a military perimeter. Civilians thought of the world as safe, predictable, but Ava knew better. Danger wasn't a thing you stumbled upon. It was always there, waiting for an opening. She set up her laptop and connected to the secure server her contact had given her. Within minutes, files flooded the screen. Rourke's criminal network, known associates, assets. He had his hands in everything from arms trafficking to high-end heists. More concerning, he had connections to people in law enforcement. That meant he wasn't just another thug. He had insulation, people who would look the other way when things got messy. She scrolled through the names, stopping when she found one that stood out. Jack Halverson, former military, dishonorably discharged, now Rourke's right hand. That explained their tactics. A crew led by a man with tactical training was far more dangerous than a pack of street-level criminals. Ava leaned back, exhaling slowly. This wasn't just about them coming after her. This was about cutting off the head before the body could strike back. Her phone buzzed. A single message. They're moving. Southside Warehouse, midnight. That was all she needed. Ava shut her laptop and grabbed her gear. She wasn't going to wait for them to come for her. She was taking the fight to them. She arrived at the Southside Warehouse an hour early, taking position in the shadows across the street. It was a familiar setup, dim lighting, multiple entrances, one guard stationed outside, likely more inside. Amateurs would go in loud, guns blazing. But Ava wasn't an amateur. She moved with the patience of a predator, slipping through the side entrance unnoticed. Inside, the warehouse was stacked with crates, gun shipments, if she had to guess. She pressed herself against a wall, listening. "You sure about this?" a voice asked, Halverson. "She's alone," another voice answered. "No backup. We hit fast. She won't even know what happened. Idiots." Ava moved before they had a chance to realize their mistake. She took the first man down with a precise strike to the temple, catching his body before it hit the ground. The second barely had time to register before she drove a knee into his gut, twisting his wrist until his gun clattered to the floor. By the time Halverson turned, gun in hand, Ava had already leveled hers at his chest. "You want to try that again?" she asked, voice calm. Halvorsen hesitated. He was smart enough to know when he was outmatched. "What do you want?" he asked. "Rourke," Ava said. "Tell me where he is." Halvorsen smirked, despite the situation. "And if I don't?" Ava tilted her head slightly. Then I make sure you leave here in a way that guarantees you'll never hold a gun again." The smirk faded. He knew she wasn't bluffing. "He's at the club downtown," Halvorsen muttered. "Penthouse level. He's expecting company." Ava smiled faintly. "Good." She struck fast, the butt of her gun connecting with his temple. He crumpled to the floor, unconscious. She stepped back, rolling her shoulders. The game had changed. It was time to finish this. Ava didn't waste a second. With Halvorsen down and the warehouse now compromised, she needed to move. The information he had given her was crucial. Rourke was holed up in a downtown club, a penthouse no less, which meant he wasn't just hiding, he was waiting. That meant one of two things. Either he thought he was untouchable, or he had set a trap. Either way, it didn't matter. Ava had no intention of walking in blind. She slipped out of the warehouse just as quietly as she had entered, disappearing into the night before reinforcements could arrive. By the time she reached her car, she had already formulated a plan. Rourke's club was a high-end establishment, a place that catered to the wealthy and corrupt. Security would be tight, armed guards, surveillance, controlled access. She couldn't just storm in. She needed an angle. She drove back to the motel and changed. The tactical gear was swapped for something sleek but practical. Black pants, a fitted leather jacket, and a simple top that concealed her holstered weapon. She checked herself in the mirror. No one would mistake her for a clubgoer, but she didn't need to blend in. She needed to look like someone who belonged. Confidence was the key. A place like that, people assumed the ones who walked in with purpose had a reason to be there. She left the motel and took a cab to the club, stepping out into the neon glow of the city. The entrance was flanked by two bouncers, the kind who didn't just check IDs but evaluated threats. She approached with measured steps, her expression unreadable. One of them held up a hand. Private event. Ava didn't hesitate. "I know," she said coolly. "Rourke is expecting me." The bouncer narrowed his eyes, assessing her. She held his gaze, unwavering. After a tense moment, he stepped aside, nodding toward the entrance. She walked past without another word. Inside, the club was alive with pulsing music, the kind that made the walls vibrate. Ava moved through the crowd with precision, her eyes scanning for potential threats. Rourke's penthouse would be accessed through a private elevator, likely in the VIP section. She made her way toward the back, spotting another set of guards near a velvet rope. This was the real checkpoint. She approached, and one of them stepped forward. "Name?" Ava met his gaze. "Tell Rourke Ava's here." The guard hesitated, then spoke into an earpiece. A few seconds passed before he nodded and pulled the rope aside. "Go ahead." She stepped through, every nerve in her body alert. The elevator ride was smooth, silent. When the doors slid open, she found herself in a dimly lit lounge. Rourke was there, seated in a leather armchair, a glass of whiskey in hand. He looked up, smirking as if he had already won. "I was wondering when you'd show up," he said. "You made quite a mess back there." Ava stepped forward, her stance relaxed but ready. "You and your crew came after me. I just returned the favor." Rourke chuckled, swirling his drink. "See, that's the thing about people like you, always so righteous. But tell me, what's your angle? You could have walked away, yet here you are. Why?" Ava tilted her head slightly. "Because men like you think you can do whatever you want without consequence." Rourke leaned forward, setting his glass down. "And what exactly do you plan to do about it?" Ava's fingers twitched at her side, but she didn't draw her weapon. "Yet. You know exactly why I'm here. This ends tonight." Rourke exhaled, shaking his head. "You think you're the first person to come after me? I've dealt with ex-military types before. They all think their training makes them invincible." Ava smiled faintly. "The difference is I don't think it—" "I know it." There was a beat of silence, heavy with unspoken tension. Then, without warning, the doors behind her burst open and armed men flooded in. Rourke stood, smirking. "You didn't really think I'd meet you alone, did you?" Ava exhaled slowly, flexing her fingers. "Didn't expect you to, but you should have brought more men." And then she moved. Ava didn't hesitate. The moment the first thug reached for his gun, she was already moving. Her instincts, honed from years of combat and high-stakes operations, took over. She ducked low, twisting to the side as the first shot whizzed past her ear. The second gunman wasn't as lucky. Before he could react, she had drawn her sidearm and fired a single, precise shot to the knee. He collapsed with a scream, clutching his leg as his weapon clattered to the floor. The others surged forward, but Ava was already a step ahead. Using the wounded man as a temporary shield, she pivoted, disarming another before slamming the butt of her pistol into his jaw. He went down hard. Another grabbed at her from behind, attempting to pin her arms, but she shifted her weight and drove her elbow into his ribs with enough force to crack bone. He let out a strangled gasp, staggering backward. Rourke had expected a fight, but not like this. He had anticipated a struggle, maybe some resistance, but he hadn't counted on facing a force of nature. Ava moved with lethal efficiency, her every motion calculated and precise. The remaining thugs hesitated, their confidence wavering as they realized they weren't dealing with an ordinary adversary, but hesitation was fatal in a fight like this. Ava capitalized on their moment of doubt, driving forward with relentless speed. She grabbed a chair and flung it into the face of the closest attacker, then spun and delivered a devastating roundhouse kick to another's head. He crumpled instantly. The sound of a shotgun racking made her freeze for a split second. Rourke stood at the edge of the room, the heavy weapon aimed directly at her. "That's enough," he growled. "You're good, I'll give you that, but you're not bulletproof." Ava's eyes darted to the side, calculating her options. The men still standing were regaining their nerve, fanning out around her. Rourke's smirk widened as he stepped closer. "You Navy types, always thinking you can handle everything alone. But here's the thing, sometimes the numbers do win." He gestured slightly with the barrel. Drop it." Ava exhaled through her nose, slowly lowering her weapon. She let it clatter to the ground, raising her hands slightly in mock surrender. Rourke chuckled. "Smart girl." He turned to his men. "Tie her up. We'll have some fun before we put a bullet in her head." Big mistake. The second one of the thugs moved toward her. Ava struck. She exploded into motion, grabbing the nearest gunman's wrist and twisting violently. The sickening snap of bone echoed in the room as he howled in pain. With her other hand, she yanked the shotgun from Rourke's grasp before he could react, flipping it around and using the stock to slam into his stomach. He doubled over with a pained grunt, dropping to one knee. Before the others could react, she fired, one shot into the ceiling, making them all flinch and hesitate. That was all she needed. Ava drove her knee into another thug's face, sending him sprawling, then slammed the shotgun's barrel against another's temple. He went down without a sound. Rourke tried to crawl away, gasping, reaching for a weapon, but Ava was on him before he could reach it. She pressed the shotgun's muzzle against his forehead, her expression unreadable. The entire room was silent, except for Rourke's ragged breathing. His hands trembled, palms raised in surrender. "Wait," he stammered. Wait, we can talk. Ava's voice was low, controlled. You had your chance to talk. She pulled the trigger. Click, an empty chamber. She had never intended to kill him. Instead, not yet. She leaned in close, her voice barely above a whisper. You're going to call off whatever operation you've got running. You're going to make sure your people know they're done. Because if I hear one more word about you terrorizing people, if I hear my name mentioned in connection to you again. She pressed the cold metal harder against his skin. Next time, it won't be empty. Rourke swallowed hard, nodding rapidly. Okay, you got it. We're done. Ava stepped back, exhaling slowly as she scanned the room. The bodies groaning on the floor, the shattered furniture, the absolute wreckage of what was supposed to be Rourke's stronghold. He had underestimated her. They all had. She turned on her heel, stepping over the unconscious thugs, picking up her discarded weapon before making her way to the door. Before she left, she glanced back one last time. Make sure you remember this, she said over her shoulder, because I won't remind you twice. Then she was gone, disappearing into the night, leaving Rourke and his shattered empire behind. Ava walked out of the penthouse, her pulse steady, her breath even. The corridor leading back to the elevator was eerily quiet, the air thick with the scent of gunpowder and adrenaline. She moved with precision, her muscles coiled like a spring, ready for anything. The moment she reached the elevator panel, she hesitated. The fight had been too easy. Rourke wasn't stupid. He had expected her, had planned for her, and yet he had been the one left on his knees, trembling under the weight of his own arrogance. That meant one of two things. Either he had underestimated her completely, or this wasn't the end of it. Ava reached into her pocket, pulling out a small earpiece. She pressed a button, waiting for the connection to go through. A familiar voice crackled to life on the other end. "You're late," the voice said. "Ran into a minor inconvenience," Ava replied, her tone casual despite the tension in her gut. "Tell me you have something." "Depends. You looking for good news or bad news?" Ava exhaled, watching the floor number slowly tick down. "Give me both." There was a pause. "The good news. Rourke's operation is definitely bigger than we thought, but you already knew that. The bad news. He's not the top of the food chain." The words settled in her mind like a lead weight. "Who?" "Haven't locked it down yet, but there's chatter. Rourke was just a middleman, a piece on the board. Whatever he was doing, it was sanctioned by someone higher up, someone who knew about you. That's why he was so prepared." Ava clenched her jaw. So it had been a setup. Not just Rourke covering his tracks, but something bigger. A test, maybe. A warning. "What's the play?" the voice asked. Ava glanced at her reflection in the elevator doors. Blood stained the sleeve of her jacket, a thin gash on her cheek from a stray fragment of glass. She barely felt it. "I need more. Whatever you can find on Rourke's connections, I want it yesterday." "Already working on it," the voice said. "But listen, you might have bigger problems. Someone's put out a feeler, a bounty, Ava. Whoever's behind this, they don't want you investigating." That didn't surprise her. If anything, it confirmed what she already suspected. Rourke was a symptom, not the disease. And whoever had sent her into that penthouse had no intention of letting her walk away clean. The elevator dinged, the doors sliding open to reveal the dimly lit parking garage. Ava stepped out, scanning the rows of cars. Her vehicle was parked 3 rows down, a nondescript sedan, chosen for its ability to blend in. She walked toward it, her every sense heightened. The feeling had settled in her gut now, the knowledge that she wasn't alone. A flicker of movement in the corner of her eye, a shadow shifting where there shouldn't have been one. Ava moved fast. Before the figure could react, she had drawn her weapon, pivoting sharply as she pressed herself against the nearest pillar. "Step out," she called. Silence, then a low chuckle. "Not bad," a voice said. Male. Amused, a figure stepped into the light, hands raised in mock surrender. He was tall, lean, dressed in dark clothing that screamed professional. Not one of Rourke's goons. Something else. Something worse. "Who sent you?" Ava demanded. "Wouldn't you like to know?" The man smirked. "Look, I'm not here to kill you. If I was, I wouldn't have let you see me." That wasn't reassuring. Ava kept her gun steady. "Then what do you want?" The man tilted his head slightly. "Just a message." He reached into his jacket slowly, deliberately, and pulled out a small envelope. He held it up between 2 fingers. "No tricks, Just take it. Ava narrowed her eyes but stepped forward, snatching the envelope from his grip before retreating just as quickly. She flicked it open with her thumb. A single card inside. A location, no name, no details, just an address. Looks like someone wants to have a word, the man said. Friendly advice? I'd listen. Ava studied him for a beat longer, then tucked the card into her jacket. Tell whoever sent you I don't take orders. The man grinned. Noted. Then, without another word, he turned and disappeared into the darkness, his footsteps silent against the concrete. Ava watched him go, her mind already racing. This wasn't over. It was only beginning. Ava sat in her car, fingers tapping against the steering wheel as she stared at the card in her lap. The address printed on it was unfamiliar, a location deep in the industrial district on the outskirts of the city. It wasn't a place where casual meetings happened. No, this was deliberate. Whoever had sent the messenger wanted her to come on their terms, to step willingly into whatever trap they had laid out for her. The thought didn't bother her. She had walked into worse. What did bother her was the fact that she had no other leads. Rourke was a dead end, figuratively and literally. His organization would fold without him, but it was clear now that he had only been a puppet, a disposable asset in a much larger game. Whoever had pulled his strings was still out there, watching, waiting. Ava exhaled sharply and started the engine. The low hum of the car filled the silence as she pulled out of the garage, merging onto the near-empty streets of the city. The sun had long since set, the neon glow of streetlights casting flickering reflections against the wet pavement. She kept her speed steady, her eyes flicking between the road and the rearview mirror. No tails, no signs of pursuit. That didn't mean she wasn't being watched. It only meant whoever was keeping an eye on her was better than most. 15 minutes later, she pulled into the industrial district, navigating through rows of abandoned warehouses and rusting freight containers. The address led her to a building that looked as though it hadn't been touched in years, its brick facade cracked and worn, the metal shutters covered in layers of graffiti. Ava parked a block away, killing the engine as she scanned the surroundings. Too quiet. No cars. To no movement. If this was a setup, they weren't being obvious about it. She stepped out, tucking her weapon into the waistband of her jeans as she approached the building. The door was slightly ajar, a deliberate invitation. She pushed it open, stepping inside. The air was thick with the scent of oil and dust, the distant hum of machinery vibrating through the floor. Overhead, a single hanging bulb flickered, casting long shadows against the walls. At the center of the room stood a single chair, and sitting in it, waiting, was a man she hadn't seen in years. "Took you long enough," he said, his voice carrying the same easy confidence it always had. Ava's stomach tightened, but she didn't let it show. "Reed," the man grinned. He was older now, the years adding more than just lines to his face. His dark hair was streaked with silver, his eyes sharp as ever. Dressed in a worn leather jacket and jeans, he looked more like a drifter than the kind of man who once commanded entire operations. "Figured you'd be stubborn about it," he said, leaning back in the chair. Still predictable. Ava crossed her arms, keeping her stance loose but ready. "If you wanted a reunion, you could have picked a better way to ask." Reed chuckled. "Yeah, well, didn't think you'd come if I just called." He gestured to the empty space around them. "Relax, no traps, no guns pointed at your back. Just a conversation." Ava didn't move. "What do you want?" Reed sighed, rubbing a hand over his jaw. "You're poking around places you shouldn't be. Making people nervous. The kind of people who don't like being in the spotlight. Then they should have stayed out of my way. See, that's exactly the problem." Reed leaned forward, his expression turning serious. "Rourke was nothing. Just another cog in a machine. But you're getting close to something that's been in the shadows for a long time." Ava studied him carefully. "And what? You're here to warn me." Reed smirked. "Consider it professional courtesy. You know I always liked you. Then tell me who's behind it." Reed exhaled slowly, shaking his head. "You know I can't do that." "You mean you won't?" "Same thing," he said. "Look, Ava, you've got skills. You're smart, but you're not untouchable. The people at the top of this don't play by any rules you're used to. You keep pushing, and eventually you're going to hit a wall you can't break through." "You underestimate me." "No," Reed said, his voice quieter now. "I don't. For a moment, the silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken history. Ava clenched her jaw, the frustration simmering beneath the surface. She had expected resistance, but hearing it from him was something else entirely. "I can't walk away from this," she finally said. Reed studied her for a long moment, then nodded as if he had expected that answer. "Then at least be smart about it." He reached into his pocket, pulling out a folded slip of paper. "This is the last thing I'm giving you. After this, you're on your own." Ava took the paper, unfolding it carefully. An address, another breadcrumb on the trail. When she looked up, Reed was already standing, his expression unreadable. "Good luck, Ava," he said, turning toward the exit. "You're gonna need it." She watched him go, her fingers tightening around the paper. He was wrong about one thing. Luck had nothing to do with it. Ava watched Reed disappear into the shadows, the faint sound of a door creaking shut behind him, echoing through the empty warehouse. She remained still for a moment, her grip tightening on the slip of paper in her hand. Another address, another step deeper into the unknown. The warning in Reed's voice lingered in her mind, but it wasn't enough to stop her. It never was. She turned on her heel and strode out of the warehouse, the night air cool against her skin as she approached her car. Sliding into the driver's seat, she unfolded the paper again, scanning the address. It wasn't a familiar location, but that didn't matter. If it led her closer to the truth, she would go. The drive was long, the city lights fading as she ventured further into the outskirts. The roads were empty, the occasional flicker of neon signs casting distorted reflections against her windshield. She kept her speed steady, one hand resting lightly on the wheel, the other tapping against her thigh in restless anticipation. There was a storm brewing, one she could feel in her bones. The moment she neared the address, her instincts flared. It was an old truck stop, long abandoned, the gas pumps rusting, the fluorescent lights flickering above the boarded-up diner, the kind of place where people disappeared without a trace. Ava pulled her car into the shadows, cutting the engine as she surveyed the area. No movement, no signs of life. That didn't mean she was alone. She stepped out, the crunch of gravel beneath her boots the only sound as she moved toward the building. The front door was ajar, swaying slightly in the breeze. Another invitation. She entered cautiously, her fingers grazing the handle of her concealed weapon. The inside was worse than the outside. Dust-covered counters, overturned chairs, the faint smell of mold and gasoline lingering in the air. But there was something else, a presence. She felt it before she saw them. The flicker of movement in the corner of her vision, the unmistakable shift of weight on an old wooden floorboard. Then the voice. "Took you long enough." Ava didn't flinch. She turned slowly, her eyes locking onto the man seated at the far end of the diner. He was older, his hair graying at the temples, but his posture was relaxed, confident. Not the kind of confidence that came from arrogance. No, this was something else. The kind of confidence that came from knowing he had control of the situation. "Figured you'd come," he continued, lighting a cigarette with an old brass lighter. The flame flickered, casting shadows against his weathered face. "You always were predictable." Ava didn't take the bait. "You know who I am," she said, keeping her voice even. "Then you know why I'm here." The man smirked, exhaling a thin stream of smoke. "I know exactly why you're here." He gestured toward the empty booth across from him. "So why don't you sit down and we'll talk like civilized people?" Ava didn't move. "I prefer to stand." The man chuckled, shaking his head. "Still the same." He took another drag from his cigarette, then flicked the ashes onto the table. "All right, then. Let's skip the pleasantries." His eyes darkened. "You're making enemies in places you don't belong." "I don't care." "You should." He leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping. "You think Rourke was bad? He was a stepping stone, a middleman. You've barely scratched the surface of what you're dealing with." Ava tilted her head, studying him. "Then tell me what I'm dealing with." The man smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "You already know. That's why you're here." The silence between them stretched, the weight of unspoken truths pressing down on the space. Ava felt it, the shift, the moment when a conversation became something else entirely, a line drawn, a choice made. She reached into her pocket, pulling out a small recorder. "Tell me everything." The man didn't blink. Instead, He crushed the cigarette against the table, the ember hissing as it died. Then, slowly, he leaned back. "All right," he said, "but you're not going to like what you hear." Ava hit record. The man's voice was steady as he began to speak, but there was an edge to it, like a man holding back the full weight of what he knew. "You think this all started with Rourke, but it didn't. He was just a cog in a machine that's been running for years, decades. The people you're chasing, they don't make mistakes, they don't leave loose ends, and they sure as hell don't let people walk away once they've seen too much." He paused, watching Ava's reaction, but she remained still, waiting. "What you don't understand," he continued, tapping a slow rhythm against the table, "is that this isn't about money. It's not about power either. It's about control. Every move you've made, every person you've talked to, they knew before you did. They've let you think you were getting closer, but you've only been following a trail they wanted you to find." Ava didn't blink. "And why are you telling me this?" The man let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "Because I know what it feels like to be where you are, to think you're the one pulling the strings. But let me tell you something, girl. You're not the one holding the knife." He gestured toward the recorder. "Turn it off." Ava hesitated. He leaned forward, voice dropping to a whisper. "Turn it off and I'll tell you what you really want to know." Slowly, Ava pressed the stop button. The silence in the room grew heavier. The man exhaled, rubbing his temple before speaking again. "There's a name, one that doesn't appear on any files, no records, no mentions. But every single decision, every crime, every death you've been chasing, it all leads back to him." He looked at her, his eyes unreadable. "You find him and you'll have your answers, but you won't like them." Ava's jaw tightened. "Who?" The man held her gaze for a long moment before finally saying it. The name. It was one Ava had never heard before, and yet, as soon as it left his lips, a strange sense of inevitability settled in her chest. Like a puzzle piece she hadn't realized was missing, finally locking into place. She repeated it under her breath, memorizing it. "Where do I find him?" The man sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "You don't... He finds you." He stood, tossing a few crumpled bills onto the table, as if this were just another conversation, just another transaction. "You've got a choice now, Ava." His voice was almost gentle. "Walk away while you still can. Or keep going and see how deep the rabbit hole really goes." He started toward the door, then paused, looking over his shoulder. "Just remember, people like him don't just let things go. And if you come knocking, be damn sure you're ready for what answers you'll get." Then he was gone, the sound of his boots fading into the distance. Ava sat there, unmoving, her mind racing. She had spent so much time chasing ghosts, unraveling layers of lies, never realizing that she had been playing right into their hands. But now she had a name, and that changed everything. Ava took a slow breath, steadying herself as she exited the dimly lit diner. The air outside was thick with the weight of the conversation she had just had, the name she had learned echoing in her mind like the final piece of a puzzle she wasn't sure she wanted to complete. She pulled her jacket tighter around her, scanning the quiet street. It was too quiet. The kind of quiet that came before a storm. Instinct kicked in. Something was wrong. The neon flicker of a gas station sign reflected in the puddles along the road, and for a moment, she caught movement in the glass of a storefront window. Someone was watching her. She didn't react, didn't break stride, but her heartbeat had already picked up. Whoever it was, they weren't amateurs. They weren't making a move yet. That meant they were waiting. For what? For who? Ava reached her car, fingers brushing over the concealed holster at her side as she unlocked the door. Just as she slid in, a sharp knock on the passenger window made her freeze. A man stood outside, face half-shadowed, expression unreadable. She didn't know him, but she knew what he was. A messenger, a warning, maybe both. With a slow, deliberate movement, she reached across, cracked the window just enough. "Can I help you?" she asked, voice calm, controlled. The man smiled. "You don't belong here." His voice was smooth, casual, but there was an edge beneath it. Ava's grip tightened on the wheel. "Seems to me like you don't either." The man's smile didn't waver. "You've been asking a lot of questions, the kind that tend to get people into trouble." He tilted his head slightly. "You sure you want to keep going down this road?" Ava held his gaze. "Pretty sure." The man sighed, as if disappointed. Then, in a movement almost too fast to track, he reached into his jacket. Ava's gun was out before he could blink. The click of the safety disengaging was the only sound between them. "That's not a good idea," she warned. The man's hand stopped just short of his pocket. He chuckled, raising his palms in mock surrender. "Easy now. No need for that." But his eyes were sharp, calculating, testing her. Ava didn't move. "You tell whoever sent you that if they want to talk, they can do it themselves." The man exhaled through his nose, as if amused. "You're bold. I'll give you that." He took a step back. "But you're also predictable. And that," he gestured at the gun in her hand, "that's why you'll lose." He turned, walking away, disappearing into the shadows as if he had never been there. Ava sat in silence for a long moment, pulse still hammering. He was right about one thing: she was predictable, but that was about to change. She pulled out her phone, dialed a number. "Yeah," she said when the line clicked. "I need to see you. Now." She hung up before the voice on the other end could respond. Then, with a deep breath, she started the engine. If they wanted to play games, she was done playing defense. It was time to take the fight to them. Ava stood at the edge of the gas station lot, the neon light casting her shadow long against the cracked pavement. The echoes of the fight still reverberated through her muscles, the adrenaline still humming in her veins. But it was over. The gang that had underestimated her now lay scattered and broken, their arrogance crushed beneath the weight of their own mistakes. The last of them, the leader who had taunted her, who had smirked as he threatened to show her what real strength was, now lay on the ground clutching his dislocated shoulder, eyes wide with a fear he hadn't known he was capable of feeling. Ava stepped closer, boots silent on the pavement. She crouched beside him, her voice low, measured, carrying none of the heat that had burned through her just moments ago. "You made a mistake tonight," she said. "You thought I was an easy target. Thought I'd be just another victim to add to your list." The man swallowed hard, pain etched into every line of his face. He opened his mouth to speak, but she cut him off. "But here's the thing about people like me." She leaned in slightly, her gaze never wavering. "We don't scare easy, and we don't forget." She stood, glancing at the others groaning in the dirt. "You walk away from this, and you keep walking, because if I ever see you again, you won't be walking anywhere." The man nodded, barely breathing. Ava stepped back, watching as he struggled to his feet, as the others did the same, limping away into the night, their pride bleeding out onto the asphalt. Only when they were gone did she let herself exhale, the tension drained from her shoulders, the weight of the moment settling in. She had won, but more than that, she had reminded them, and anyone else who thought they could take advantage of someone like her, exactly who they were dealing with. The gas station was quiet now, eerily so, the world seeming to hold its breath in the aftermath. The clerk inside peered cautiously through the window, too afraid to come out, but knowing he owed his safety to the woman who now stood alone beneath the flickering lights. Ava reached into her pocket, pulling out a few bills, sliding them into the clerk's tip jar before heading to her car. She had no interest in thanks, in recognition. She never had. She just wanted to be left alone. But some people didn't seem to understand that. As she slid into the driver's seat, her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, a name she hadn't seen in a long time, a name that meant trouble. She let it ring once, twice, before finally answering. "It's done," she said simply. A pause on the other end, then a quiet chuckle. "I figured. You always were a tough one." A beat of silence stretched between them before the voice spoke again, more serious now. "But you know this isn't over, right?" Ava closed her eyes briefly, then started the engine. "It never is." She hung up, tossing the phone onto the passenger seat. As she pulled onto the empty road, she glanced at her reflection in the rearview mirror. The woman staring back at her wasn't the same one who had walked into that gas station tonight. She was sharper now, more certain, and she knew deep down that this was only the beginning. As the city lights blurred in the distance, she tightened her grip on the wheel. If the world wanted to test her, it was in for a rude awakening.